Senator, you've spoken about how your former pastor in Chicago, the Reverend Jeremiah Wright, was critical in helping bring you to Christianity and is like part of your family. Could you tell us how he helped bring you closer to God?
Well, I actually wrote about this in my second book, Audacity of Hope. I had worked as an organizer on the South Side, as I mentioned, and it was tough work. The community was in difficult straits, and I was bringing churches together to set up job training programs and after-school programs for youth and to try to bring economic development to the community. I had been raised in a non-religious home. My mother was the most spiritual person I know, but was mistrustful of organized religion, in part because of some of her experiences seeing segregation being compatible with organized religion. And so we went to church very infrequently. So as I'm doing this organizing, some of the pastors started saying, you've got great ideas, Obama, but if you were going to organize churches, it might help if you were going to church. And I thought, well, that's not an unreasonable position. And so I started visiting some churches. Trinity United Church of Christ was one of the churches that we were trying to get involved in the organization. I visited that church and found the ministries that they were doing on HIV/AIDS and on prison ministries. There were a whole host of wonderful ministries that they were engaged in. And Reverend Wright's sermons spoke directly to the social gospel, the need to act and not just to sit in the pews. And so I found that very attractive and ended up joining the church when I got out of law school. Now I have to say that, in reports subsequently, there's been this notion that he was, by various terms, my spiritual advisor or my spiritual mentor. He's been my pastor. And what that means is that, the ministries that have been built in that church community have been very important to me. It also means that there are areas where we've disagreed on. And obviously the most recent loop that's been playing, Reverend Wright's greatest hits, so to speak, are I think, both a distortion of who he is and what the church has been about, but also express some comments that I think are deeply offensive and are contrary to what I believe, and I've told him so, and have made a lot of statements about that, including one pretty long one in Philadelphia. But that doesn't detract. That, I think, doesn't detract from the incredible church community that this is. And I think that all of us who have been part of a faith community know that that the church is a body of believers, and it brings in the imperfections of us, men and women, and pastors are imperfect. Certainly the membership is imperfect. I, as somebody who is sitting in the pews, is a sinner and is imperfect. And that doesn't detract from, I think, what the church is supposed to be about, which is to worship God and proclaim the good news.
Senator, you are a Christian, but as a child, you had more exposure to Islam than probably most Americans ever will. How did that shape you?
Well, I lived in Indonesia for 4.5 years when I was a child. And actually, ironically, the first school I went to in Indonesia was a Catholic school. Myself and Senator Bob Casey, who's sitting here, we had pretty similar experiences, probably in part of at least our elementary school. I then attended a public school, but the majority of the country was Muslim, and the brand of Islam that was being practiced in Indonesia at the time was a very tolerant Islam. The country itself was explicitly secular in its constitution. And so you didn't have the oppressive state that was trying to impose people's religious beliefs. And Christians and People of other faiths lived very comfortably there. And women were working and out and were not wearing the traditional coverings that we see in the Middle East. And so what it taught me and what it still teaches me as I think about foreign policy now is that Islam can be compatible with the modern world. It can be a partner with the Christian and Jewish and Hindu and Buddhist faiths in trying to create a better world. And so I am always careful and suspicious of attempts to paint Islam with a broad brush, because the overwhelming majority of the people of the Islamic faith are people of goodwill who are trying to raise their families and live up to their values and ideals, and to try to raise their kids as best they can. And that's something that I think we always have to remember, as opposed to assuming a clash of civilizations that sometimes our overheated rhetoric politically has talked about.
Let's go to Reverend Jim Wallace. Reverend Wallace, he is president of Sojourners, a Christian social justice organization. Reverend
Hello,
Wallace.
Senator.
How are you, Jim?
I'm good.
Good.
As you reminded us a week or two ago, when Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was killed 40 years ago, he wasn't just speaking about civil rights. He was fighting for economic justice, was about to launch a Poor People's Campaign. Yet 4 decades after the anniversary of his death, the poverty rate in America is virtually unchanged, and 1 in 6 of our children are poor in the richest nation in the world. So in the faith community, we are wanting a new commitment around a measurable goal, something like cutting poverty in half in 10 years. Would you at this historic Compassion Forum commit to such a goal tonight? And if elected, tell us how you would mobilize the nation, mobilize us to achieve that goal.
Well, first of all, Jim, I appreciate the good work you've been doing on these issues. And I absolutely will make that commitment. Understand that when I make that commitment, I do so with great humility, because it is a very ambitious goal. And we're going to have to mobilize our society, not just to cut poverty, but to prevent more people from slipping into poverty. You know, this actually goes back to the earlier point you raised, where Senator Clinton suggested I was being elitist when I said that people are frustrated and bitter. That is absolutely true. That's not just true in small towns. That's true in urban areas. That's true in my community of the south side of Chicago, because people feel forgotten. They feel as if nobody's listening in Washington. And that every 4 years we have politicians who come out and make promises, and they're not kept. And so that's why I wanted to put the caveat on there. I make that commitment with humility, because we've got a lot of work to do economically in this country to bring about a more just and fair economy. It starts with, I think, recognizing that wages and incomes for average families have gone down during the most recent economic expansion. That's never happened before in the history of America since we started recording these statistics, at least since World War II. And so we've got to shore up the mortgage market to make sure that we don't have millions of people who are losing their homes. We're going to have to, I think, change our tax code. For us to provide tax breaks to the wealthiest among us, those who didn't need them and weren't even asking for them, at a time when ordinary folks are struggling to fill up the gas tank just to get to a job. I met a guy here in Pennsylvania when Bob Casey and I were traveling around, who told me his problem was he's looking for a job and it costs him more than he can afford just to go to a job interview. And so we've got to give them some tax relief, and we've got to invest in our infrastructure to create jobs, particularly those who are going to be getting laid off of the construction industry as the housing market goes down, and I've put forward very specific plans for that. We're going to have to, I think, invest heavily in clean energy. And if we have a cap-and-trade system, we can generate $150 billion over 10 years to invest in solar and wind and biodiesel and train people to build windmills and build solar panels and make buildings more energy efficient and make alternative fuels. All these things will strengthen the economy generally. And I left out one last point, healthcare. People are falling into bankruptcy. They are going without medical care. It is a moral imperative that we make sure that we have a plan in place that provides health care to every single American.